Hello, I'm Bart Schultz, the director of the Civic Knowledge Project at the University of Chicago. 66 years ago, back in 1942, some amazing events took place here on the south side of Chicago. This documentary is going to help you learn about this forgotten chapter of history. You're going to meet some of the early heroes of the civil rights movement, some people who are often not celebrated in the histories of that movement. But they were instrumental to it. Brilliant community organizers taking heroic actions on behalf of civil rights. This is a project that's very close to the heart of the Civic Knowledge Project because this is the type of civic knowledge that we think you most need to have.
My name is Timuel D. Black, T-I-M-U-E-L, D as in David, Black, B-L-A-C-K. And I am a retiree, a professor emeritus at the colleges of Chicago. But most of my life has been spent in trying to make this a better world through various means, political, economic, whatever way it can be. And I'm just happy to have the opportunity to express my feelings and some of my experiences.
I am Jim Robinson. I had come from New York. I had a degree from Columbia, but I wanted to get a master's degree in English for the University of Chicago. Professor Crane, who was the head of the English department, was not enamored of what I was doing on campus. But he was stymied, of course, because the president was Hutchins, and Hutchins was on our side of the integration struggle.
I'm George Hauser. I had come for my senior year at Chicago Theological Seminary. I was here in Chicago only from 41 to 44. We covered the same years, Jim.
Yes.
I came in September of 41.
I did too, or early October maybe it was.
I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, December 7th, 1918. And folklore has it that when I was 8 months old, I looked around in Birmingham at that pier and said, I'm leaving here. So I brought my mother and father, brother and sister to Chicago. Yeah. When I was 8 months old, my mother said, Dixie, that boy doesn't even know how to change his diapers. I'm going with him. So I came to Chicago. Now, I'm a contradiction in many ways. My mother had a kind of turn the other cheek attitude about things. My daddy, not having read it, but taking the philosophy of one of the great English philosophers, and that was peace if possible, but justice at any rate. And so I'm caught in the complexity of those things. Long
before I was reading Gandhi, it was this business of non-injury, not killing animals and so on. The first experience that led me in that direction was going fishing with my grandfather. And we caught a couple of fish and we put them in the pail to carry them home. The fish kept gasping, and I could remember a music teacher who was rather a frivolous person, and she said, oh, the fish are suffering. And it went into my head that, yes, they were suffering, and that we had caused them to be suffering. And by the time I got home, I decided maybe if you don't like suffering, then you don't eat meat. And the next day was a Sunday. We went to church, and we came back, and I loved bacon. And they had bacon for breakfast, but I didn't eat the bacon. And my mother later took me to the priest, and he, disagreed with my position. But I kept the position, and I didn't eat meat from the time I was 9 years old until I was out here in Chicago. I was 24 or something at that point. And that made me a vegetarian. I went from vegetarianism to pacifism. My commitment along those lines has remained very strong for me. And I didn't feel that everyone else had to follow it, however. And but that's me.
I'm a child of the 30s, and an important part of my life is that I believe in one step at a time. taken from the hymn, Lead Kindly Light. I do not, the final words of one of the verses is, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. And you take one step and it leads to another. I was influenced by the motivation between the two world wars in looking upon the First World War as a terrible tragedy. I can still remember the books I'd see with the awful slaughter of people. And this was part of the youth movement of the 1930s. To go into another war was unthinkable. When I was in my third year at Union Theological Seminary in New York, 1940, the Selective Service Act was passed in September of 1940, and a group of us had to decide what we as ministerial students were going to do about it. We had a natural exemption. We didn't have to do anything except register. And we said the one way we can refuse to cooperate with this system of war and killing is to refuse to register. So 8 of us refused to register on the date of October the 16th, 1940. We were immediately given subpoenas to appear before the grand jury, and a month later, in November, we were sentenced to a year and a day in prison, which was a felony. And so this was one of the great decisions, one step, as far as my own activity was concerned. In prison, we were faced with the problem of racial discrimination, because blacks would be seated on one side of the auditorium and whites on another. In the mess hall, there was this discrimination. And this was long before I was thinking about anything like CORE. It was just a natural reaction that people should not be separated this way. And so we protested against, we had hunger strikes, and we violated the principle by sitting with our black friends and comrades. And for that, we would be punished. We would be put in the hole. We went on a work strike and spent 30 days in isolation. There's a lot of stories that one could tell about this, but this was part of my background. And when I was released, I was contacted by A.J., before I was released from Danbury Prison, I was contacted by A.J. Muste, M-U-S-T-E. He was the new executive secretary of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which we refer to as the FOR usually. He invited me to come to Chicago. I had still 1 year of graduate school and seminary to do, but we had difficulty getting back into Union Seminary. We'd got so much publicity that it hurt the seminary, because they thought that we should have been expelled. We were not. So I came out to Chicago in the fall of 1941 to organize on behalf of the FOR in the Chicago area. I was at the Chicago Theological Seminary, where the work we were doing was on the whole not only acceptable but applauded by some. I had a relationship with Jim and the group on the campus.
Right.
But I organized about 17 groups throughout the Chicago and environs area, and this was one of the groups. We were in the midst of a study of Gandhi's autobiography and of the book War Without Violence by Krishnalal Sridharani.
Krishnalal Sridharani was a graduate student at Columbia, and he wrote a thesis which was called War Without Violence, which was a sociological dissection of what Gandhi had been doing in India. And that put things step by step and made it much more easier for us to pattern projects here in this country based on what Gandhi had done, because Gandhi tended to be so spiritual, you didn't get the nuts and bolts. We were particularly interested in race relations because we were frequently attacked for not supporting the war or the coming war because of the Hitler discrimination against the Jews. And we said, you know, we don't need to go abroad to fight race. There's so much race discrimination right here. And that's kind of the way that we got started on that idea.
The philosophy of nonviolence is that you hope to have an effect on your opponent. And from a Christian perspective, you could say the final example of this is Jesus on the cross.
Right.
And the results of that. Now, you hope that you will have something of that effect on your opponents. We experienced it in smaller ways, but we've also experienced it in larger ways.
And you've sometimes experienced it part way. We lived at Ellis Avenue in that interracial group. Occasionally we go over to 63rd Street to a cafeteria where I very often ate my dinner. And of course you get into a line, and the cafeteria people always served us. But one night I was over there by myself, and when I'd finished my dinner, a young white fellow followed me outside, and he said, "You got to stop bringing niggers in here." And I said, "Well, I don't think I'm going to stop bringing Negroes in here." We walked along a little way. We came to one of those storefronts that had a display on this side, display on this side. It was glass all the way in. And he pushed me to the back of that. And I said, "You know, you can beat me up, and I'm not going to do anything about it, but that won't stop me from bringing blacks to the restaurant when I want to." I was frightened to death, to tell you the truth, because I thought I was going to get all cut up. Well, he didn't come over to my side of point of view, except that he really couldn't beat me up. He just left me and went.
When I was in the South with Dr. King, we call that disarming.
Yep.
Enemy, disarming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You take away their weapon. They expect you, like when Rosa
Yeah.
Parks sat on that bus, they purposely made it a woman rather than a man, some assuming that they would be less likely to beat up a woman, you know, regardless of color. And when she refused to go, then those of us who began to participate here in Chicago as well as in the South, we, white or black, we had to be trained to be, you know, take those blows and things.
Ultimately, you have to be ready to accept the consequences of your action. Mm-hmm. It may mean arrest, it may be a beating.
We kids embraced that idea, that we could make a change without being violent. Now that wasn't philosophically ours, but that was our behavior to get the greatest results. With many of the core people and the SNCC people and SCLC people, it was a way of life.
Here we were studying Gandhi's autobiography. We were studying Krishnalal Sridharani's War Without Violence, The Power of Nonviolence by Richard Gregg. And we said, now we ought to be able to apply this to this racial situation.
Most of the houses where black people lived were not maintained, and where white people lived, they were maintained. And yet the rents and the sales prices were higher in the black neighborhoods than in the whites. And people had gone around, real estate people had gone around and gotten the owners to sign legal agreements that they would not rent or sell to black people. Now they worked these both ways. They would then try to sell to black people themselves, and if they did it block by block as they moved east, they could turn a block from white to black and profit from both sides.
Now the point is that this became a matter of discussion at the cell group at the University of Chicago.
Right.
And one of the things that was decided in line with Shridharani and Gandhi was that this restrictive covenant condition should be challenged. One of the first thing that happened was, and Jim was so much a part of this along with Jim Farmer, setting up an interracial fellowship house, as they called it, in an area covered by restrictive covenants, which was a nonviolent protest against the restrictive covenant system.
Well, what happened was that we leased a house for 6 months from the real estate office at the University of Chicago, and it was the house that Edgar Lee Masters had owned. It was full of his books, and it was owned by his divorced wife. And so she signed all the papers, and we moved in, and then she discovered we were both white and black, and she was not happy about it. So we stayed there, yes, we stayed there, and when the weather was clement and all, we invited people over from the community area, the black community, to come and sit on the front porch. We had 4 lovely rocking chairs, and so all the neighborhood soon got to know they had one house that was integrated in spite of the covenants. We used to go out here to the 55th Street Promontory and have our interracial picnics, and it was a very friendly neighborhood because most of the people who came out were influenced by the University of Chicago. We went every weekend in the warm weather. And sometimes, I think usually on Sundays. I don't think we usually went on Saturdays. We decided that we'd always gone down here where blacks integrated with whites. And so one Sunday we decided we'd go to 31st Street where whites would have to integrate with blacks. And we were very welcome up there, and we had a wonderful time. We had our headquarters in the basement of the Woodlawn AME Church. Well, this was a very important place in the early Corps. It certainly was. It was head of National Corps. Arch Carey was important to us as a senior advisor. Bernice Fisher was probably responsible for this more than anyone, because she joined when Archibald Carey was the minister here. Right. As I remember, Jimmy, we're talking about 1942. Early 1942. Right. I think it was January. Yes. And you and Jim Farmer went out in the neighborhood to get a cup of coffee. Right. And you went to a place called Jack Spratt's. Right. And what happened? We went to the counter. There were counters and there were tables. And we hadn't anticipated any trouble. We just went to the counter and ordered a sweet and a cup of coffee. Well, we got the sweet and the cup of coffee, but we realized that they were not happy with our being there. So a few nights later, we went back, and then they made it very evident we were not welcome. And at one point, when we went, we got the coffee and the sweet, and they wouldn't take the money. So we left the money on the counter, and they came out and threw it down on the street. After you and Jim Farmer had your experience there, and we spent a lot of time, the first thing we did was to write a letter to the management of Jack Spratt's. We didn't get any satisfaction. I don't think we had an answer. Right. Then we went in and had a discussion. Now, as I remember, we thought we were dealing with a man, but actually we were dealing with a woman who was the proprietor
Now, when we went in on that day in April, I think it was, of 1942, we didn't have a huge group, but we had enough to occupy all of the space, the counter space, plus some of the tables.
Right.
So that the regular patrons coming in were having a difficult time finding a place to sit down.
Right.
Now, I remember the woman came out and she said, "You can sit here till midnight, but you will not be served." And this was, the latter part of the afternoon. And we were prepared to sit there. We were prepared to stay there all night. She then called the police. Now, what happened then?
Well, I think you had talked to the police department before. Someone had talked to them, and they came down and they said, well, if they're trying to buy food, that's what a restaurant is for. You know, the police can't do anything about it. We can't put them out.
The police have sometimes not been very friendly, but on this occasion, I must say they acted pretty well.
Yes, they did.
Because they said there's no riot taking place here, and they left. And we were served. That was one of our victories.
It was one of our victories, and the Chicago Defender had sent a reporter and a photographer, so it all appeared in pictures in the Chicago Defender.
Now, we had a different kind of experience at the White City roller rink. There we decided when we were going to take direct action that we would have a line of those who were waiting for service to get in to buy tickets, and at the head of the line would be a black person.
Right.
And if the black person was refused a ticket, we would all just stand there. And I remember we had support for this from the labor movement. We had a lot of labor people there, from some church groups,
Right.
Student groups, the NAACP.
Right.
And we had a pretty good standing line.
Yes.
And when it didn't move, there was a problem. But they did not arrest us, but we weren't getting any place.
Right.
And as I remember, that was the one case where we violated our principle that instead of direct action, we would take legal action.
Right.
And we took it to court with NAACP lawyers, and it was thrown out of court. We did not win on the court case.
I remember that after that had happened, I said to myself, why didn't I oppose taking it to court in the first place? We have a method that we know works, and we don't need to be tied up with government, which we know to be corrupt anyway. So I was quite nonplussed and kind of shocked at myself for never having thought of that in the first place.
Well, what happened, of course, we lost the case in court, and then it lay dormant for some time, but then it was reactivated, and we won the case.
Yes.
And White City did become integrated.
Yes.
So it was begun by core action. I can remember when we had our sit-in, which was a pretty large one, at Stoner's restaurant, that Mr. Stoner, with whom we had carried on long negotiation discussions in which he was adamant that he was not going to serve any, as we said, Negroes at that time, he came along and he gave me a kick in the shins.
Right.
And Jim Farmer writes about that in his autobiography.
Right.
And he says, I don't remember this, I think he made it up. He says that I said, "That's all right, Mr. Stoner. It doesn't hurt very much," or something like that. So Stoner's was in the loop. That's another big case.
It was very good food at very moderate prices. So it was jammed full. People stood in line to get in.
Yeah. Now that case took place, really developed over a period of months, and came to a head in June of 1943. And it was the occasion of the first national conference.
Right.
which was held in Chicago, and we decided that as a part of the conference, we should have a real action project. And we had been building up to this Stoner's case for some months in trying to negotiate with Mr. Stoner, and with passing out leaflets saying there are how many restaurants in the Chicago area do not discriminate. Please, when you pay your bill, indicate that you want this to become an integrated restaurant. We had had months going on with that. And I remember being in and out of that restaurant trying to talk with Mr. Stoner. Previously, on occasions when we had had test cases there, Stoner himself would go into the kitchen and make garbage sandwiches. And we would have black employees come out from the kitchen and say to us, "Don't eat those sandwiches."
Right.
We saw them being made. And he took the bad tomatoes and the bad lettuce out of the garbage can.
Right.
So we had some backing in that sense. So it came to the date of the conference when we had quite a group gathered together from, I don't know, we had 15 groups maybe represented there, plus our Chicago contingent.
Right.
And we had enough people there to occupy a number of the tables. We had whites filtering in, not necessarily with one another, and seating themselves throughout the restaurant. And then the first interracial group came in and stood there. And there were 2 or 3 blacks among that group that came in. They were not seated. They stood there for an hour, and then they were seated. At that point, the second interracial group came in, which composed mostly of blacks. I was a member of that particular group, and I remember it. That's when Stoner came along and gave me a swift kick in the shin. What happened was really, we couldn't have orchestrated it better. Somebody who was not connected with the core group invited one of the black ladies in our group to come and share her table.
Right.
She went. She was served.
Right.
And then somebody else took it on from there until all in that group had been seated, and then somebody started applauding, and that whole restaurant burst into a great applause for a victory. What happened was that over a period of hours that this campaign went on, people who were not part of our group, opposed to the segregation policy that Stoner had, joined in. We had black people working in the kitchen who came out and said, "We won't work until you are served." We had people who were sitting there who said, "We will join you in this." Now, that would not have happened if we had taken a very aggressive policy. The police, I say, were called, and they couldn't make an arrest because there was no conflict taking place. That was the end of discrimination at Stoner's. They had called the police. He called the police.
Right.
And they, in turn, did not make any arrests.
Sure.
They left and said there's no racial problem here. And Stoner was left without anything to do unless he wanted to close the restaurant up. So we all were served. That was one of our big victories.
Oh, it was a
Yeah.
very big victory because it was open and it stayed open. There was no backtracking on it at all.
Yeah. Well, Jim, we're standing here in front of Reynolds Club.
And this is where I went on a test with Bayard Rustin, and they refused to cut his hair. I don't know how we happened to discover that the barber shop didn't cut the hair for black students, but we did discover it. So one day when Bayard Rustin was there, he and I went to the barber shop, and they wouldn't cut his hair.
I remember we took advantage of the fact that Bayard was coming through.
Right.
And he agreed quite readily to go in and try to have his hair cut
Right.
at the barber shop here in Reynolds Club. And indeed, he was refused. And we took that up with the university, and the policy was reversed after some pressure was put on, and that became a case for CORE to deal with, which we did, and successfully. CORE started here in Chicago, and due to some of the excesses and because of the dynamics of the time, and because of the field work that Jim Farmer did and that Bayard Rustin did and others around the country, there were CORE groups that sprang up around the country. And it was in 1943 that the national organization, which in 1944 took on the name of the Congress of Racial Equality, to designate the national organization. But each of the organizations was very much a local, but it was very difficult to pull them all together in the national organization. I think that probably one of the more successful aspects of this was the first Freedom Ride, which we called the Journey of Reconciliation in 1947, that Bayard Rustin and I organized. Our original plan had been Washington to New Orleans, which of course the 1961 Freedom Ride, we got so much publicity, carried out. But the 1947 plan had originally been that, but on the basis of advice from the southern people that we contacted, they said, look, make this first one a test case to find out what happens in the Upper South. So we set it up for Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And we traveled between April 9th and April the 23rd, 1947. There were 26 tests of bus and train policy. There were 12 arrests that took place. 3 of our guys spent 30 days on the road gang, the chain gang down in North Carolina, from an incident that took place in Chapel Hill that year. And of course that breaks down into a lot of interesting little details of what happened on those buses. Conrad was the first arrested in Petersburg on April the 13th, I think it was. He was a civil rights lawyer. We lived in the same community in New York, and we were old friends. He refused, he was sitting in the front, I was in the back in the Jim Crow section. And others of our group were scattered around because we had it pretty well organized with, one of us had to carry bail money because we knew there were going to be arrests, and others were mingling in with the other passengers. We weren't obviously there as a group. Conrad's sitting up in front. The bus driver came, you got to move. He said, I can't move. And he acquainted the bus driver with the Irene Morgan decision of the Supreme Court, handed him a copy of it, which we had on hand. So our purpose was to test the law and to acquaint bus drivers, police, our fellow passengers, And we had meetings every night. That night in Petersburg, we had a meeting at Virginia State University, located in Petersburg.
Yeah.
And we had them all the way along. We had the names of all the NAACP lawyers and the groups, NAACP groups. We had meetings on college campuses, in church groups, and community groups. We spent months organizing this and raising funds for it. Bayard and I took a preliminary trip in January. The ride took place in April. In January, Bayard and I went through the whole itinerary, and every place we went, we made contacts with churches and with the NAACP and students to set up these meetings, and also to be sure if an arrest took place there, we would have a lawyer on hand who could defend us, and we would have bail money on hand to bail them out. The emergence of King in the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56 was really the changing of an era, almost. We got started here in Chicago with a small group. We were an interracial group of goodwill who were prepared to take nonviolent direct action. And maybe we inspired a few people, maybe a few organizations got started. Here was a group of whites and blacks who had a great comradeship with one another, and we got a few things going. But the whole mood and the momentum of the movement changed as soon as, in this case, Rosa Parks and then Martin Luther King came along with that Montgomery bus boycott. This was something in the South where the Jim Crow laws existed, and that changed the tenor of the whole campaign. I was there at the March on Washington, and I knew King, but he became a good supporter of our work in the American Committee on Africa. Whenever we brought an African leader over to and we brought a lot of them over to the United States, we always made sure that they got to Atlanta or wherever King was at the time to meet him. And there was a great correspondence between a Kenyan leader, Tom Mboya, whom we brought over in 1959, and King, because the civil rights movement in the United States and the African liberation movement were growing larger and more effective at the very same time in history. It was during that period from 1952 on through the 50s and through the 60s that the African liberation movement was growing. And it was on the basis of that the American Committee on Africa was able to exist and do something. And it was on the basis of the civil rights movement in the United States, starting small, that in the case of CORE, grew larger as the momentum took place, particularly after the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56. And the March on Washington in 1963 became a very, very important moment, with probably the largest mass gathering up to that time that had taken place in Washington. So things move, and it's been good to be, at least to some degree, a part of both the struggle in the United States and the struggle in Africa in their moments in history, because they were two of the great movements of the 20th century.
A topic that I'm very interested in is how students can mobilize a community and what role that students can play, because this is something that both of you have a lot of experience in. And I mean, as a student in the south side of Chicago now, I find that, or at least I've found that it's rather difficult. And I know that you had touched on how technology today can even impede mobilizing and getting people involved. But what other thoughts did you have?
Well, my student days are a long time behind me. But it's true, I was a student at one time. And I guess my organizing started when I was a student. I think the principal thing about organizing is you've got to have a project. You have to have an objective. When you're starting something new, you can only get excitement and support for it because it itself is worthwhile and exciting and should draw support, at least from a few people who are prepared to take the risks involved. I think the organizing core here was a good example of it. The way it got started in Chicago, around the White City roller rink, around the Fellowship House, around the Jack Spratt sit-in, the Stoner sit-in. You had to have something specific, and then people who are interested, maybe not many, will come forth.
You have to start with people that you believe can help you do it. And this is either people who are doing it or people who are in the community.
You don't need many people to challenge an injustice. You need a few who are willing to challenge it and to stick to it and go the second mile on the effort.
And the main thing, I think, that for many people, young people today who are concerned, is they have confidence in you. They have a feeling about your integrity and your intelligence and your personal courage. That gives them the same kind of attitudes and feelings. You are giving them answers to their problems. You're responding to a felt need, psychological felt need. And the people who feel that need someone that they can trust who can articulate that need for them. See? And that's the organizing. And the fact that you are willing to put your goods on the line to help satisfy their need. And when it becomes psychological and emotional, and once that becomes ingrained, they organize themselves. You know, you're just there, but they organize themselves.
You've got to have something that you are working for and build excitement and support for it. You get an idea and you are excited about it, whether it's a sit-in, whether it's a freedom ride, or whatever it might be. And you don't stop to think too much about all of the consequences down the line. You know that there may be some danger involved, but that isn't what you're thinking about. How can we organize this thing? How can we raise the funds we need? How can we get the recruits for it? All of the minutiae that go into planning a project, and that carries you on. And then when you get to the point that you're in it, you're no longer planning, you're there. You just have to take it as it comes because you've prepared the groundwork for it.
And you can't get out. You're in it, you can't get out.
Well, you can, but it wouldn't look very good.
No.
Well, personalize a little bit. I was in Richmond, not Richmond, I was in Camberley, Virginia, and my brother was down at Camp Butner down in North Carolina. And they were getting ready to ship us out. We were getting ready to go overseas. I jump on the bus and sit down. I hadn't even thought about it. I would have gone to the back of the bus. And now we've been told that we're going to be going overseas very soon. white guy gets on the bus, I guess with his girlfriend. He's in. Right then I decided, I'm talking about decision making. Right then I decided it's time to die.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just that quick.
Yeah.
Right.
See, it's time to die.
Yeah.
That's great.
And yeah, that's a feeling that you get, and you can't resist that feeling, or you'll be embarrassed. You feel embarrassed to yourself. Now that's almost as individualistic, and people who have the strong historical feeling about human beings and human rights and things of that sort, they have to get involved. Otherwise, they'll be embarrassed to themselves.
I have a couple of themes in life, one of which I've already mentioned, believing in one step at a time, because one step leads to another, and you do not know what the end will be. But you embark on that journey, and you stick with it. Now that got me into jail as one who refused to register for the draft, but it got me into CORE. It got me into the African struggle for liberation, and who else? Who knows where else it might lead. Now, there's another theme that I learned in the African struggle, and it comes from a phrase which was used particularly in the Portuguese territories of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, which were Portuguese colonialism. And that is the phrase, a luta continua. The struggle continues. And indeed, it never ends. There are always issues that must be faced. There are always injustices around you, of which you must be conscious and be ready to tackle them. So I believe in the struggle continues. Now, I may approach it a little bit differently at something over 90 to when I was 24 or 25. I guess I'm not ready now to, what else might be new that one can start, but I'm ready to participate. And I'll get on that vigil line as long as I can. And I'll support the environmental movement. And putting your trash in 3 or 4 different receptacles at home is something I believe in, and we do. We haven't gone all the way with our electric light bulbs yet, but that's on the agenda.
I belong to the Social Action Committee of Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church, and I ran that committee for a little while, and then I said, you know, I'm too old to be running things, and we found a young woman who runs it very, very well, and so I don't go to the meetings anymore. But whenever they have leaflets to distribute or forms for people to sign up and join the committee, I go over and I can cover 3 or 4 or 5 masses, because I don't live very far from the church, and I can get meals in between. So I do that. My liability to social action is something I haven't given up, but I certainly have restricted it.
We had no idea when we took on any of these early projects of CORE that maybe that was the end of it, right there. And yet it led to the Freedom Rides of 1947 and 1961, and CORE became an important national civil rights organization with many problems. After all, 3 CORE workers were killed, were massacred down in Mississippi doing work for CORE in the voter registration drive, 1964. So you have some setbacks and you have some victories. A little earlier there was a question raised, well, have you really made a difference? Have you seen anything change? And I think we have. Even the freedom rides caused great issues, but also wrought change. And that's what you hope to do.
The behavior of those people who were active in the Corps and the SNCCs and the labor movement, which prepared and laid the groundwork for the possibility of the emergence and success of the Harold Washingtons and now the Barack Obamas. Thank you. See, these young men have made a difference in the world. You can measure what they have done because they made a change. And that breaks up a society which at that point of time would resist or did not want change.